Hey everybody, we are back. I forgot to turn myself on. There we go. And thanks for joining me. We are reviewing I guess it's not redacted now, it might still be redacted, transcript from the genetic genealogy challenge in the Brian Kohberger case. And we're reviewing it right now in depth because there's a book coming out called Broken Plea, which what I hear talks about some of the stuff. And so I had originally provided commentary on a live YouTube video way back then when the not before the trial, before the plea. And I don't know if it had all the information in there, so I thought it would be good to go through this again, and we're going to have a live call where I discuss the book because there's been some scuttlebutt on X about it, okay? So previously, what we're doing is in this section, we've got, and I don't want to get her name wrong. Sorry, I don't want to make you guys dizzy. Okay, we've got Rylene Nowlin from the Idaho State Police. And the defense attorney for Mr. Kohberger had been asking her about accreditation, CODIS standards, and things like that. And so she says right now she's a CODIS user, which means she just, I don't know if she submits, but she's different than what she was in November of 2022. She used to be the alternate state administrator for Idaho, okay? And CODIS is where they take a type of genetic profile. If you're not following along, I really suggest, even though they're long, they're about an hour each, go back and listen to or watch the other sessions because it really explains everything and what we're leading up to at this moment. In this challenge, the defense attorney, she's trying to get the FGG out of the case, okay? And they're having some procedural challenges here. But CODIS uses STR, short tandem repeat, and we explain that in the second video towards the end. And now we're talking about, she goes through it here, and now we're talking about genetic genealogy. So she's asking about SNP profiles, or what we call SNP profiles. Okay, so we're going to start here. So the defense attorney, she says, do you know what a SNP profile is? And Ms. Nowlin says, I do. What is that? A SNP profile is a single nucleotide polymorphism. So you're looking at a nucleotide, whereas the STR is a series of repeating nucleotides, a specific repeat that we're looking for. Biology, okay? If you think about it, you're looking at a lot more in depth. The SNP then, is that a closer look at a person's genome? Now, she says, like I say, I would like to state that I am not an expert in SNPs. I'm not qualified in the SNP technology and have not ever been qualified in the SNP technology because she does CODIS. Keep my hand up here so you can see. She does CODIS, which is completely different than SNP, which is used for genetic genealogy. Two different lab processes, two different things. And that's why, unfortunately, for forensic genetic genealogy, we have to retest in these cases. We have to spend more money and retest and re-pull DNA because the STR, the CODIS sample that was originally pulled doesn't work. Okay. So she says, with STRs, depending on the chemistry, you're looking at anywhere from 13 to 25 plus locations. With SNPs, my understanding is in general, you're looking at a minimum of 10,000. So that's a huge, bigger expanse. So the defense attorney asked, does that mean that there's more information about a human contained in a SNP than there is in an STR profile? Now, Mr. Nye, I believe he might be with the prosecution. He says, I'm going to object at this point. He's interrupting. This witness is not disclosed as an expert, and she just testified she's not an expert in SNP technology. Okay, this is the prosecution's witness, I believe. Okay. So the judge says, the court, this is the judge, says, I appreciate that with respect to her answer, and I will take that into account. I don't know if you can hear those geese crazy. I don't know what's going on outside. I appreciate that with respect to her answer, and I will take that into account in the event the defense intends to rely on that testimony. I took it as a sort of background about her general knowledge. I'll allow it for now. I'm not taking it as expert testimony about that SNP beyond the basic understanding of what SNP is. Okay, so Ms. Taylor, she's the defense attorney. She says, thank you. She says to the witness, Ms. Nowlin, do you remember my question? And she said, yes. I would assume if you're looking at the larger part of the human genome, you would be getting a larger amount of information about someone. And so the defense says, I have one more question about CODIS, and then I want to move in a different area. You mentioned that there's 4 indexes, and you talked about a forensic index. Correct. What is that one used for? The forensic index is where profiles generated from items of evidence can be uploaded. There are rules about what can be uploaded, though. Okay. So let's say we have this pen and a suspect profile came, if this is a piece of evidence and the suspect profile came off of it, okay, we're talking about putting it into the CODIS system, into the database, so it can be matched, right? So she says it cannot match someone known to be the victim of a crime. It cannot match someone whose DNA should be in a place outside of a crime being committed. It cannot be anything taken directly from a suspect of a crime where you would reasonably assume their DNA would be present. It must be related to a crime, and it must be believed to be from the putative perpetrator of that crime. We're getting a lot of tongue twisters here. Let me see if I can explain this. And again, I'm not a CODIS database expert, okay? But what they're talking about is they have, let's say, silos, let's say file folders in the CODIS system, right? Like you would have filing folders in your cabinet. And in the forensic index, that is something that came off an evidence item. So those are unknown people. Those are suspects, right? That's what she says, putative perpetrator. That's a big word, 2 big words for the suspect. So in the suspect folder, there can only be, it can't be the victim, because the victim wouldn't be a suspect, right? It cannot match someone whose DNA should be in a place outside of a crime being committed. That means somebody, let's say in a house, and we've talked about in some of these, I believe we talked about the Nancy Guthrie case. A family member is normally in her house. And if a family member is not a suspect, they're not a suspect, but their DNA is going to be in the house, right? So this is this second part. It cannot match someone whose DNA should be in a place outside of a crime being committed. So that means, okay, that's not a suspect either. So it's not going in the suspect file folder. It cannot be anything taken directly from a suspect of a crime where you would reasonably assume their DNA would be present. So I'm taking a stab here, bad word. I'm taking a guess here. They're talking about buccal swabs from suspects, DNA from suspects, because we have to have the unknown perpetrator at the crime, and then we compare it to a suspect. All right. So in the unknown suspect folder, there's unknown suspect DNA. If we have a suspect, the suspect goes in the suspect file folder. So it can be compared, okay? So that's what I think she's saying. So the defense attorney says, so if I understand it, you use DNA, yet an STR, that's the little profile, and only under certain circumstances you can use CODIS. Do I understand that right? Correct. Okay, outside of CODIS, and I understand what that does, if you create a profile, a DNA profile of somebody, is that a separate thing you do in your lab, even if you're not going to run them through CODIS? Yes. When we receive items of evidence or samples from unknown individuals, we generate a DNA profile from those. Okay? Because it's not like, let's say you got, excuse me, a blood sample from somebody. You can't put the blood in the computer, right? It has to be electronic data. So what they do is they take the evidence item and they look for all the DNA on it and they develop profiles. So I'm touching this pen. Theoretically, they're going to get a female DNA profile from me. Now, I could have carried it in my purse and somebody could have picked it up and borrowed it, and there could be a second profile on there. There could be a third profile. And those are, if you think about them, people whose DNA could be on. So they have to, wipe it down, swab it down, however they're going to get the DNA off of it, and develop a profile. It's kind of like, think about fingerprints, right? Fingerprint, separate little fingerprints, separate profiles. Okay? There could be, depending on how many people touch things, bleed on things, spit on things, pee on things, do other things on things. Okay? We could have different profiles. Okay, so they get the evidence item, they do their thing, and they get profiles. So now she's asking her, how did you become involved in the homicide in Moscow from 2022? She said she's involved as the manager of the laboratory in Meridian. Earlier in the testimony, she said that the Idaho State Police in Meridian is the only state police lab in the state. So she said, so she's the manager of the lab. So she says, I haven't done any work on the evidence in the case or issued any reports. Okay, so she's just like the boss over the lab. Defense attorney says, all right, is it fair you say you did not go to that residence then? Correct. That's referring to the house where the crime happened on, King Street. Correct. As the lab manager, do you understand about what evidence has come into the lab from that case? She's saying there was a lot of evidence submitted. I have a general knowledge of items that have come in, but I could not provide you a detailed list off the top of my head. Lots of evidence in that lab. Lots of evidence from just one crime. Lots of evidence from that case. Like, that's normal. Okay. So she continues, as a lab manager, are you aware of different bits of testing that were done related to this case? She says, in general, yes. And the reason she's probably asking her is because previously in video 2, episode 2, she talked about accreditation and quality control and stuff like that. So it could be her job as the lab manager. We don't know how many supervisors in between, but it could be her job to review everything that comes out. So she asks her, are you aware of a profile called Unknown Male A? More explanation in, I believe it's video 2. Yes. Where did that come from? Sorry, guys, I've got some dust or something going on here. Okay, so So we've got unknown male A, and previously, I believe she was asking about unknown male D. And we had talked about that the defense attorney was asking about blood on the banister between the levels, I believe, if I remember correctly, and blood on gloves that were outside, and DNA on a knife sheath. Okay, so those are the things that we're looking at. So now she's asking about, are you aware of a profile called unknown male A? So just remember, as an example, if this was an evidence item, they would have taken, like if I was the only profile in here, they would take it off and they would say unknown male, well, say unknown female A. Okay, but so they take the evidence, they develop the profile, they give it a name. So they have some piece of evidence that they developed a profile, and they called it, the lab called it unknown male A. So she says, yes. Where did that come from? To her recollection, this is the lab lady, unknown male A came from a swab taken from a knife sheath that was submitted by the Moscow Police Department. So then the defense attorney asks, are you aware of unknown male B? Now, I just want to stop here for a minute, because remember what we just talked about, the file folders and suspect folders, known people folders, right? Victim folders, they can't mix. And we talked about how people who are known to be there shouldn't be in the suspect file. Okay? And we reference Nancy Guthrie as an example, poor Nancy. But it's good because it's top of mind for folks. If Nancy's family, who was probably in and out of the house, and her friends, who we've seen her playing cards and all that stuff, they're not going to be in the suspect file because they're going to be known. They're not going to be unknown. So anybody unknown, what do you think? You think they're going to be a suspect, potentially, right? And if we go back to the lab manager's words, she says, in the forensic index is where profiles generated from items of evidence can be uploaded. There are rules. Okay, and she goes through, it can't match someone known to be the victim. It can't match someone whose DNA should be in a place outside a crime being committed, like a family member or a resident. It cannot be anything taken directly from a suspect of a crime where you would reasonably assume their DNA would be present. That's like a confirmation buccal swab testing. It must be related to a crime, and it must be believed to be from the putative perpetrator of the crime. Suspect. Right? Okay. So, going back to okay. Are you aware? So, unknown A came from a swab taken from the knife sheath. We've heard a lot about that knife sheath, right? So the defense asks, are you aware of unknown male B? And she says, this is Miss Nowlin from the Idaho State Police Lab, she says, I believe that was another sample from hearing the previous testimony. That's in either video 1 or video 2. Number 1 or number 2, that with the detective corporal from the Moscow police. I believe that was another sample that was from the house. Okay, so that was either the glove on the front door or the banister. So the defense attorney says, look, I only want you to testify from your own knowledge. And so she says, from my memory, I don't know where B came from. So the defense attorney says, okay, thank you for clarifying that for me. And when folks testify, they really want, they don't want you to have to refer to your notes and stuff. They want you to try to remember. So if you can, you can. If you can't, you can't. So the defense says, are you aware that investigative genetic genealogy or forensic investigative genetic genealogy, or what I call it, forensic genetic genealogy, was used in this case? Yes. What was your role in that? My role, this is Miss Nowlin from the Idaho State Police, my role specific to this case was facilitating the signing of a memorandum of understanding, making sure all parties received it and had signed it, those parties being the police agency, the prosecuting attorney's office, as well as a member of ISP's management team. And then when the preliminary report was received, okay, I'm assuming that's from the vendor, my job was to look over it, ensure that it had all the required pieces in the report, and then to authorize payment of the invoice for that testing. Now, if you're only watching video number 3, I believe it was video 2, the defense attorney asked the detective, the main detective on the case, did you get a report? And he said no, right? He said no. So here, she's saying I'm supposed to look at a report and authorize payment. So the defense attorney goes further. What role did you have with the laboratory that was going to perform the forensic genetic genealogy work? Ms. Nowlin asked, as far as how we came in to be contracted with them? So she says, when ISP, that's the Idaho State Police, decided to pursue a contract with a laboratory that could perform the SNP testing that we talked about earlier, we're a state agency. So we don't just get to call up anybody and hire them. So we had to go through a bid process. Okay. So right now, maybe with the exception of 1 or 2, this SNP process, this FGG process, this lab extraction to get the SNP profiles and the whole genome sequencing, the police labs don't do this. Many people don't understand this. So they have to outsource it. Okay. So her being the lab manager, she was managing that. Okay. So she's saying they had to go through a bid process. And then they chose the vendor. Sometimes it's a triple bid. Who knows? Okay. So she said as part of this bid process, she had to develop the scope of work for the invitation to bid. Sometimes you may know it as a RFP, request for proposal. She had to develop the scope, meaning what the requirements were, what they were going to ask for, as in what we expected the vendor to perform. And then when the bids came in, I was involved in the team that evaluated the documents that were submitted. And then ultimately, the division of purchasing determined who won the bid. So she says, this is the defense attorney, did the Idaho State Police Forensics have a contract with this laboratory, Othram? And she says they were the winning bid through the process. And so they were under contract with the Department of Purchasing, correct? And the defense continues. Is the contract with the Department of Purchasing that you perform these services and we pay you for them essentially, or does it have more meat to it to talk about some of the things that you were talking about? How you help develop, I guess, the job description and what would be required. So I think what she's talking about here is it a, we're going to need 100 big pens every month and you can produce this big pen? Or does it mean we don't know what we want. We're going to have to figure out what we want, and we're going to need your help to do it. More meat on it. Maybe it means that every case might be different, but the base, a pen is a pen is a pen, but maybe sometimes it has some doodads. I don't know. That's the best way I could describe that. So Ms. Nowlin continues, I'm not really familiar with the Department of Purchasing's day-to-day operations or how they operate. My role was strictly developing the scope of work. We expect them, that's the lab, under contract, to develop profiles that can be uploaded to the public genealogy databases. So that would be a SNP profile, not an STR profile. Okay. We expect them to provide us a written report. We expect the report to contain certain things, to have a header, to have a date, to list the case number, have page numbers, those kind of things. Well, I hope it would be a little more than a report. Seriously. Okay. The defense continues. Outside that description of the scope of work and requirements, did your lab have a separate contract with Othram that basically said you agree to do these things? Now, we don't know which you that is. So does that mean that Othram is telling Idaho State Police what to do? Or is Idaho State Police telling Othram what to do? So in the scope of work for the contract, she's saying, well, we're going to get a profile that can be uploaded. We're going to get a report. It's going to have a header, a date, a case number, page numbers. Like, that doesn't sound very substantial, does it? So the defense is saying, is there anything else that we don't know about that is not in the purchasing original triple bid contract? Okay. So Ms. Nowlin says, we had that they won the bid from Division of Purchasing, and that's the state contract for performing the work. The defense continues. You mentioned a memorandum of understanding you helped facilitate to be signed by the parties. Was Othram one of the parties that signed that? She says no. This is a memorandum between the law enforcement agencies, the prosecuting attorney's office, and the lab. Okay? So I believe what she's saying here is in the memorandum of understanding, the lab is clarifying what the prosecutor expects of them and what the police department, right? Because remember, Idaho State Police is the only lab, like, obviously they're going to have their troopers in the Idaho State Police, but Moscow PD doesn't work for Idaho State Police. Okay? So what Idaho State Police is saying is when we're going to work together, that we understand that this is how it's going to go. Who's going to run it? What's going to happen? Expectations of the lab. Okay. And the defense continues. In that memorandum of understanding that indicated that the interim Department of Justice interim policy applied. Is that right? And this is a huge can of worms. And Ms. Nowlin says, I believe it did. I don't have the exact text memorized. And this is huge. So I'm going to go back to that. Let me finish this exchange. So the defense says, if I showed you a copy of that memorandum of understanding, would that help you remember if it was part of it? Yes. So the defense says, Your Honor, if I just have a moment to gather that, it's not being offered as an exhibit. And the judge says, just to refresh her memory. Miss Taylor, the defense attorney, says it's to aid in her memory. The court says, show it to the state's counsel because they've got to approve it. Okay. So I guess they nodded. It's not in here. Okay. Now, if you're a cop listening to this, this is something that we need to talk about. Because the DOJ guidelines only apply to federal agencies. and their guidelines. And they're very restrictive from a police work perspective, speaking as a detective. So if you're not receiving federal funds and the feds are not involved in your case, you don't want this. So I don't know if the Idaho State Police receive federal funds. But going under this, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but it's restrictive. It's unduly restrictive, in my opinion. So if you're a police detective, your police agency happening to listen to this, you need to scrap this. Okay? It's from 2019. Okay? It's 2026 as I record this. And if you want to talk about it, we can talk about it. Maybe I'll do a separate video on that. Okay? So what Miss Nowlin from the Idaho State Police is saying here is that she incorporated these guidelines in the Memorandum of Understanding. And that could be because she said, I'm not an expert in genetic genealogy. Okay? So this is sad that it's in there. But we don't know exactly how. Okay? So let's see what's going to happen. So the defense attorney asks, does looking at that, the Memo of Understanding, refresh your memory as to whether the Department of Justice Interim Policy applied? And Ms. Nowlin says it does say it applied. Okay. So the defense says, and Your Honor, I'm going to refer to Defense Exhibit D19 here and ask the witness to be shown that, and then I'll provide the court my copy. And the judge says, where was this filed? And this is, if you go back to video 1, there's all this hullabaloo about all these numerous files, and he's not happy, the judge, and whatever, okay, which you'll see right here. Okay. So blah, 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 they're going back and forth when it was filed. So finally the judge files it. Okay. So now once he files it, she can ask her about it. So the defense says, is that the Department of Justice Interim Policy? And Ms. Nowlin says, yes. And the defense says in Section 7, I believe it's Section 7 or page 7. And Ms. Nowlin says, quote, investigative caution, that section. And the defense attorney says, let me ask you the question. And that's interesting. That's interesting that Ms. Nowlin, I'd be interested to know whose witness she is, because how does she just know to bring that section up if that's the section? Is that the section? Yes. Let's see. Right? Like, how would she just know that? She don't know nothing about nothing, but how does she know that? Like, was she prepped in time beforehand? Like, whose witness is she? Is she the prosecution witness? And she knows that? I don't know. Very weird. Okay. Just weird to me. So the defense says, let me ask you the question. Are you familiar with the provision in that policy that says, if there's a prosecution case, if somebody is arrested and there's a prosecution case, all items in the forensic investigative genetic genealogy should be preserved for court purposes? I mean, that's just common chain of custody. Okay. And Ms. Nowlin says, I believe that is part of, I don't think it's in Section 7. It might be. I believe it's part of preserving. So I guess she's saying it's in there. And so the defense says, okay, I want to know what Othram preserved. And she says, I don't know. Now, we have to go back to, I believe it was video 1, it could be video 2, where the lead case detective on the case, the detective corporal, was asked about reports from Othram because the case got taken away from Othram. And he's like, I don't know, nothing about nothing. I didn't see anything. Lead detective. Okay. So now the defense attorney's asking the lab lady who's in charge of it, okay, from the lab point, what did they preserve? All items, and I don't know if that's the wording, all items. Is that all evidence, all report, like all items is pretty broad. So Ms. Nowlin says she doesn't know. And the defense says, what did you get back? And she says, we received a preliminary report. In other cases, we will sometimes get back DNA extract that was sent to them. I don't recall if we got that back in this case. Anything our laboratory receives, we return to the submitting agency. So let me explain that. So that sounds like everything, when I said everything. So the lab process, if you're not familiar with it, I think we talked about it. They're going to take our evidence item, and you know, they can't, like I said, they can't shove blood in the computer. So they take it, they take off, they get the biological cellular material, they spin it down, do whatever they do with it. They extract it, right? So let's say there's a pool of blood. They're going to extract it and create a sample to pull from. Okay, there's going to be a quantity of DNA, aside from other trash and debris and things, okay? So depending on how much DNA, obviously if you have a pool of blood, that there's going to be a lot to work with. But if you only have a little piece, little section, there's not going to be a lot. But they take it off, they take out all the profile, right? They make a profile, all that stuff. How much do they have to work with? So in this case, it sounds like they sent Othram the evidence, the sheath maybe, clothing, bedding, who knows, sent the piece to Othram because the SOP said developing a profile. We expect them to develop the profiles. Okay. Okay. So she's saying in some other cases, they get the DNA extract that was sent to them. So now it sounds like from that ISP, Idaho State Police, was creating the extract that Othram would then, in this case, develop the genome, okay, to put into the computer databases. So she says, I don't recall if we got it back in this case. Anything our laboratory receives, we return to this submitting agency. So that would have been Moscow PD. Okay. And the defense says, would validation be part of that? Validation studies. Now, I think I know where she's going with this. Ms. Nowlin talked about accreditation for CODIS and FBI, right? Well, if you have watched number 2. Maybe she did it. No, not in this one, number 2. So I think validation, Ms. Nowlin talked about her roles and the things she did. So now the defense is asking about validation. So it sounds like the defense is saying, did you validate what Othram did? And she says, I wouldn't assume so. I wouldn't assume that would be part of this, no. So the defense asks, would bench notes be important? And the judge says, he interrupts, he said, I didn't hear that. And Ms. Taylor, the defense attorney, confirms bench notes, lab bench notes. And what that is they note their process. What tests were run, blah, 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 blah. It's their log, like it says bench notes, but it would be like log notes. Okay, notes. I did this, I did this, I did this. Bench notes. Lab bench. That's the desk, when they sit at the bench. Okay. So Ms. Nowlin says, for our laboratory, we designate those as part of our case record. Yes, you normally see those. What did you do? How did you do it? When did you do it? So she says, I'm not familiar with what Othram designates as part of their case record. And for my cops, if you are listening to this, this is what I'm telling you when you have somebody else other than a forensic focused person, company, lab, volunteer, whatever, doing work that should be done by law enforcement trained people who know what belongs in a case and what the end result is going to be. And I will get off that soapbox for right there. But, okay. So she says, Ms. Nowlin says, they only have the preliminary report. So how do you get a preliminary report? Was stuff done to get a preliminary report? Or does it say we got this stuff by FedEx? Like, we don't know. Okay. So the defense says here, all right, I'll move to a different line of questioning. It's about the requirements with Othram. You mentioned that she's talking about Ms. Nowlin. The goal was to create profiles and create a report, but to search public databases. Ms. Nowlin says, correct. There are public genealogy databases that will allow entry of law enforcement samples, and that is part of the scope of work. They were required to enter it into those databases. So they have to develop a profile sufficient and in accordance with how it needs to be done to get in the databases. Like your Mac thing won't work with your Windows thing, right? So you have to have the right things in the Apple Store are in the Apple Store, and things in Google Play Store are in the Google Play Store, okay, because they're different. So Othram has to develop it so it works in the database system. So the defense says, and are you aware there are databases that do not allow law enforcement to search? Yes, unfortunately so. And Ms. Nowlin says yes. So the defense continues. Were you part of work after Othram began their work to try and do an investigation? She says, I was not. As far as, I guess I'm unclear. We, being the lab, received evidence submitted to the laboratory before, during, and after for all sections. Is that what you're referring to? And the defense says, let me rephrase my question. I think it's too broad. While Othram was doing their work, were you, Ms. Nowlin, or the lab, part of any work to help Othram? For instance, did you get any documents that you did research to try to help Othram? No. Defense asks, were you aware that Othram was just stopped from doing any further work at some point? She says, I was aware of that. And the defense says, and was this before they produced any result? And the Ms. Nowlin says, no. We received a preliminary report. I recall receiving it because that's how I know I can approve payment of the invoice. So I know we received that prior to them being told they were stopped. Now, let me just comment here from a business perspective or a person perspective. What does that say there? Preliminary report. Preliminary report. Not identification, not we're done doing our work, not final report, and they're getting paid. Is that what you're understanding that to be? Because that's what I'm understanding that to be. Isn't that special? So you're supposed to frame out a whole house and you put up the studs, whatever, for one room, and you're done and you get paid? Okay. So continuing, the defense says, were you part of the decision to stop them? Ms. Nowlin says, I was not. Defense asks, how did you find out about it? And she says, I found out about it in an email from my laboratory system director. Now, so she's got somebody above her. Remember, she said she was the manager. So we were not sure exactly what role she had in the lab. But now we know that she's got somebody above her. And the defense asks, do you remember when that happened? She doesn't. Does the forensic lab, goodness gracious, continue to contract with Othram? Yes. I'll leave that there. Defense continues. If Othram had a file that would have had validation studies and bench notes, anything they did on the case, who would have received that? And she says, Ms. Nowlin, again, validation studies would be odd to associate with individual cases, so I wouldn't assume they would do that. Again, I'm not familiar with their procedures. And as far as who would receive documents, usually it would be, I would assume, the agency which we received that preliminary report. Now let's go back a moment. She said that the contract says they get everything back. And she talked about bench notes, and she talked about receiving different things in other cases. And she's a lab, right? So I don't know, maybe she's thinking that they're going to send the bench notes to the detective? I don't know. Okay. So the defense says, you mentioned you're not familiar with their procedures. She says, not in detail, no. So the defense asks, what procedures are you familiar with? For Othram? Yes. So she says, this Idaho State Police, as part of the bid process, all of the bidders were required to submit, I believe they were required to submit their procedures. And it was essentially just looking over them to say, yes, they have a procedure. Not, is it a good procedure? I mean, that's what I'm reading. Yes, they have a procedure in place for doing SNPs. So yes, they meet the minimums for the invitation to bid. So did the bid say, do you have a procedure? Or did it say, do you have a bid? You must have a procedure that meets our standards or scientifically established standards. Okay. She says, but again, I'm not qualified in that technology. So I wouldn't have studied them or rendered an opinion on them. So it's free for all. It's free for all. So the defense says, I won't ask you for your opinion on them. I won't ask you to quote them to me, but you saw those. She says, yes, at the very beginning of the bid process. So the defense says, okay, let's switch gears. In the case we are here for today, do you recall there being a trash pull? And the court reporter says, what? She says a trash pull. And a trash pull is, I'll just tell you guys, the trash pull is when somebody puts their trash out, like you or I put their trash out for the trash to be collected, and the cops come and take it. And depending in the jurisdiction, whether they need a warrant, whether it's private property or whether it's public property, once it gets out to the street, they gonna take it. Very common. Used to do it all the time. It's very stinky, but it's very revealing, FYI. Okay. So Ms. Taylor now says, was there a trash pull? And she says, I recall receiving evidence from a trash pull. Correct. Defense says, what role did you have in deciding anything about that trash pull? She says, nothing about the trash pull occurring. I do recall there being a brief. I can't remember if it was a phone meeting or a video meeting, and just being asked in general what items from someone's trash are good for DNA. So it sounds like to me at this point, they might have honed in on Brian, and they're like, okay, we need to confirm we need to confirm the result that we have. Remember, they got that phone call, Brian Kohberger, I got a tip for you. So they're going to try to match it. And how are they going to match it? Well, they don't want to, tip him off. So they're not going to call him to come in. So they're going to do what's called surreptitious. Okay. So they, without him knowing it. So they're going to go for the trash. So she's there. She got a call and they say, what's good? Because Miss Nowlin in the lab, they get DNA off of items all the time. So they're saying, what should we go for? What's going to be good to pull out of the trash? So she's asked, did you receive items to test? Yes. What instructions were you given about those items? And she says, Miss Nowlin says, the discussion was a person of interest had been developed and to analyze the items from the trash to determine if they could be inclusive of the DNA profile that was developed from the knife sheath, unknown male A. And there is a whole lot of talk about inclusive statistics and all that stuff. We're going to skip over that. Okay. We could do that in another, if you want it, whatever. Okay. So defense asks, what date did you receive the trash? And she says the trash was received in the laboratory on December 28th, 2022. And as we go through the case, we had the tip call from the FBI to the lead detective on December 19th. They had a Google Meet meeting on December 20th, and blammo, they got the trash on December 28th. So defense says you were looking for a male profile. Correct. Did you find male profiles? And Miss Nowlin says, I didn't perform the actual testing, but yes, there were male profiles developed. Going back to our evidence item, depending on how many people touch it. It's a lipstick, but we'll talk about how many items, right? People in the trash. If there's multiple people in the household, you're probably going to find different profiles on different items. So she says, yes, there were male profiles developed, plural. How many? I don't know. Do you know anything about either male profile or any of them? I believe one of the male profiles designated as E was determined they could be from a biological parent or child of the profile from the knife sheath. Okay. So in CODIS with STR, okay, the only way they're going to do 1-to-1, and what they pulled that trash for was 1-to-1. Got him. Is this him? And we're saying him in this case because it's a boy. They got to match 1-to-1. Now, people confuse this all the time. Familial searching, the familial term is not genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy. The old term, familial search in CODIS, gives you exactly what she's saying here. a close relative that could either be a parent or child is a familial hit. So you're close, okay? You know, what's that game, Marco Polo? You're close, all right? So what she's saying here is that they pulled the trash, and I believe this was pulled at the parents' house in Pennsylvania. So theoretically, there could be, depending on what day you pull the trash, was Brian there yet? Was it a week's worth of trash? I mean, all kinds of things go into it. What's the propensity, the probability that there's going to be more of dad and mom than Brian? Okay. How much trash does a person create? Okay. So, bingo, it's either a kid of the suspect or, well, she's calling it a person of interest. Now remember, it's supposed to be eliminated from those silos. It's not a victim. It's not somebody that was supposed to be in the house, right? We've eliminated all those possibilities. So person of interest, we're thinking it's the suspect. So they compare it and they know, bingo, either somebody in the house is his dad or his kid. Could be a possibility. Okay. Brian could have had a kid. Okay. So now the defense is asking, and are you aware that Brian Kohberger's DNA was in the trash? She says, I was not aware. Did you become aware? I became aware later. We didn't have his name at the time. And that's interesting that of all those items in the trash, they didn't get his. So I don't understand how that's going, but maybe we'll find out. Okay. So she's saying that Miss Nowlin is saying she's not aware that Brian Kohberger's DNA was in the trash. And did she find that out? Yes, she found out later. She didn't have his name at the time. And the defense says, you didn't know his name on December 28th. And she said, no, I did not. So she may have been only operating under unknown profile A. And the detectives sometimes don't tell the lab people. Okay, so that she just knew she was trying to match unknown profile A. All right, and then the defense says, were you on December 28th, were you aware that not male E, but another male profile had been identified? And Miss Nowlin says, defense says the trash. Miss Nowlin says the trash pull. I knew there was some mixtures of DNA that were also included. Okay, I'm lost. Okay. So the defense asked, one of the mixtures, did it have a male DNA profile? I believe it did. Is this the trash? It's the trash. Okay. I knew there were some mixtures of DNA that were also included. Defense says, one of the mixtures, did it have a male DNA profile? I believe it did. And wasn't that profile the major component of that profile with a minor female? And they're not talking about minor as in kid. They're talking about a mixed sample that the majority of the sample was from a male and a little bit was from a female. And she says, I believe that sounds correct. And Miss Nowlin, or the defense says, and later, didn't that return to Brian Kohberger? And Miss Nowlin says, we actually didn't perform that comparison. Okay, so what it sounds like to me, and I don't know, that what it sounds like, the Idaho State Police got a good sample from the trash, which turned out to be, we know now, we think, Brian's dad. Okay, from the trash in Pennsylvania. Because it came back and it said parent or child. It also sounds like they had another mixture that had part male and part female. The majority male, the smaller part female. But they did not run that mixture. Okay, because they said they didn't perform the comparison. But it was Brian's. They found out, well, she didn't answer that. She just said we didn't perform it. And then it came back later to Brian Kohberger. Okay. We're going to stop there because we're at an hour.